Welcome, dear listener, to the Sleepy Mythologist. Tonight we'll journey far back beyond the pages of ancient books, beyond even the rise of empires, to the dusty lands of Mesopotamia, where one of the world's oldest stories still whispers through time, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This epic, carved into clay thousands of years ago, holds more than just myth. It reveals how ancient people understood death, the soul, and the yearning for immortality. As we gently explore its meaning together, let the weight of the day melt away. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether you're curled up in a quiet corner of Norway, sipping tea in Malaysia, or drifting off in the heart of Brazil, leave a comment below and let's map our little community of dreamers. Now, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you like, and let's begin our journey. In the beginning, long before the stories of Achilles or Arthur, there was Gilgamesh, a king carved from both divine essence and human clay. He ruled over the ancient city of Uruk, a place whose walls kissed the stars and whose temples shimmered with the reverence of gods. But Gilgamesh was no ordinary man. He was 2/3 god, 1/3 human, a blend of celestial power and mortal fragility. From the moment he drew his first breath, the world seemed to tremble slightly, as if it recognized something extraordinary had entered its fold. This peculiar ratio, 2 parts divine, 1 part human, was no accident. The gods of Mesopotamia had created Gilgamesh with intention. His body was perfect, tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly strong. His mind was quick and his charisma undeniable. Yet, it was that final 1/3, the human part, that made him suffer, that made him yearn. That part would one day make him afraid to die. In Uruk, his name stirred awe and fear. The people admired him, yes, but also whispered about him behind closed doors. Gilgamesh was a powerful king, but his heart was restless, like a storm that never found calm. He built magnificent ziggurats, laid the first stones of libraries, and turned wild plains into city walls, but he also taxed his people harshly, forced young men into battle, and claimed women as he pleased. His divine heritage gave him the power of the gods, but not always their wisdom. The elders of Uruk prayed for relief. They offered sacrifices not to change the weather or to stop a flood, but to soften the heart of their king. And the gods, watching from their realms above, listened. They knew Gilgamesh had been made strong, too strong. Without balance, even the greatest gifts can become curses. And so the gods devised a plan, not to weaken Gilgamesh, but to awaken him. They would give him a mirror, not one made of silver or glass, but of flesh and soul. Someone who could stand beside him as his equal. Someone who would challenge him, teach him, and perhaps bring out his buried humanity. But before that, before the arrival of this companion, we must linger for a while on who Gilgamesh truly was in these early days. Imagine him walking the great avenues of Uruk, the golden sun glinting off his bronze armor. His footsteps echoed like the beat of a drum. No one dared look him in the eye, not because he was cruel in every moment, but because he was untouchable. There was no one he could talk to, no one he could love, not really. To be 2/3 god is to be alien among men. He had no peers, only subjects. And still, somewhere deep within him, a quiet ache stirred. It came to him in dreams, in the silence of moonlit nights when even the air seemed to whisper of eternity. He would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of stars falling, of rivers turning to dust, of himself standing alone on a plain, screaming at the heavens. The dreams disturbed him. Not because they were terrifying, but because they felt true. He didn't yet know it, but Gilgamesh was already beginning to feel the weight of his 1/3 mortality. That small sliver of humanness, so easily overlooked, pulsed like a quiet drumbeat beneath his grandeur. It asked questions the gods never had to answer. What happens when power isn't enough? What is a life if it ends? The clay tablets that tell his story do not describe these emotions in modern terms. They speak in symbols and myths, in divine omens and sacred dreams. But beneath those layers, we can hear the same questions that stir in us even now. What does it mean to be alive and to know that one day we will not be? In the earliest chapter of this ancient tale, Gilgamesh was still a man untouched by answers. He ruled with might, with pride, with unstoppable energy, but he had not yet begun the true journey, the one inward, the one toward wisdom that would come. But first the gods would send him a challenge, a reflection, a friend. For now though, let us leave Gilgamesh where he stands, in the bright sun of his early days, with the weight of power on his shoulders and a shadow beginning to form just behind him. A shadow named Mortality, and soon that shadow would begin to speak. Far from the towering walls of Uruk, beyond the reach of kings and priests, in the quiet places where the earth still breathed wild and free, a different kind of life stirred. He was not born in a palace or shaped by divine command. He came from the deep silence of the wilderness, where the wind danced through tall grasses and lions slept in the shade of acacia trees. His name was Enkidu. He was not raised by men, but by animals. His limbs were strong from running with gazelles, his senses sharp like the lion and the wolf. He knew the language of the wind, the rhythm of rivers, the secret rustling of snakes in the underbrush. He ate what the animals ate, drank from the same springs, and lay beneath the stars with no roof above his head. Enkidu was the wild, untamed, unshaped, unspoiled by the hand of man. And yet he was not just an animal. He was something more. The gods had created him too, sculpted him from clay as they had Gilgamesh, but for a different purpose. If Gilgamesh was made to rule, then Enkidu was made to remind. He was a living memory of what humanity had once been, before cities, before kings, before temples and taxes and war. In him the spirit of the earth still pulsed, raw, instinctive, and untouched by pride. The people of Uruk had never seen such a creature. Word of him spread like fire through the reeds. A man, they said, who ran with beasts, a man who tore down traps and released animals from cages, who protected the wild as if it were his home. Hunters feared him, priests denounced him, but the common folk whispered with awe. Perhaps this Enkidu was not a threat but a balance, an answer to their prayers. Gilgamesh had grown too proud, too distant from the living pulse of the world. The gods, in their mysterious wisdom, had created Enkidu not just to oppose him, but to teach him. And so the two destinies began to turn toward each other like stars caught in gravity, though neither of them knew it yet. But Enkidu's transformation had to begin before their meeting. The gods sent a woman, a temple priestess named Shamhat. She was not just a woman of beauty, but of wisdom, of sacred knowledge. Her body was a bridge between heaven and earth, and her presence was a force of civilization itself. She found Enkidu by the watering hole, where he drank with the antelope and rolled in the grass. She approached him gently, her steps soft as moonlight, and sat beside him. For 6 days and 7 nights, she offered him love, not just of the body, but of the human world. Through her, Enkidu experienced something he had never known: tenderness, intimacy, the ache and warmth of human connection. And with each passing moment, the animals began to retreat from him. They no longer recognized him as one of their own. When the 7th night ended, and the sun rose like a golden eye over the plains, Enkidu was changed. His body still bore the strength of the wild, but his heart had begun to open to something else, something that could feel sorrow, longing, and wonder. He tried to return to his animal companions, but they fled. The gazelles no longer waited for him. The lion no longer greeted him with a growl of recognition. He wept, not because he was weak, but because he had been made aware. In those tears lay the first sign of his awakening. He was becoming human. Shamhat spoke to him kindly, as one speaks to a child seeing the world for the first time. She offered him food, bread and wine, the gifts of civilization. Enkidu tasted them, and with each bite he crossed another threshold. His body slowed. His thoughts grew deeper. The wilderness, once his only home, now seemed distant, dreamlike, as if it had always belonged to another life. She brought him to a shepherd's camp, where he learned to wear clothes, to speak in full sentences, to eat at a table and laugh around a fire. The people there accepted him cautiously at first, but soon grew fond of him. His strength was unmatched, his heart surprisingly gentle, and yet, in his eyes, there always remained a flicker of the wild, a distant echo of something untamed. Civilization had touched him, but had not erased his essence. News of Enkidu eventually reached Uruk, a man who could rival Gilgamesh in strength, who walked like a god but lived among men. It was unthinkable. Gilgamesh laughed when he heard it, until the dreams began. Ominous dreams filled with signs and riddles, a star falling from the sky, an axe appearing at his feet. His mother, the wise goddess Ninsun, interpreted them carefully. She told her son that he would soon meet a man who would change his life, not an enemy but a brother, not a threat but a mirror. This man, born of the wilderness, would be the only one who could stand beside him without bowing, and through him, Gilgamesh would begin to understand what it meant to be human, not just a ruler, not just a god, but a man with limits and longings. And so the wild man walked toward the city, unaware of how much he would soon lose and how much he would gain. Enkidu, once the guardian of beasts, now moved toward a new destiny, one where he would meet Gilgamesh, and through conflict, companionship and tragedy help reshape the soul of a king. But in this moment, as he left the wild behind him, Enkidu carried with him something precious, an ancient innocence, a deep memory of the earth, and the silent wisdom of those who live not for conquest, but for balance. A wisdom Gilgamesh had yet to learn. In the city of Uruk, where the walls touched the sky and the scent of incense floated through temple courtyards, Gilgamesh reigned with an unshakable grip. His voice echoed across the plazas, and his command could stir armies into motion. Yet beneath all that power, there stirred something silent and invisible, a longing neither glory nor conquest could satisfy. Gilgamesh was praised by the priests, feared by the elders, admired by the warriors, but he was alone, truly alone, for what god after all walks side by side with men? And then, as if summoned by the very ache in his soul, Enkidu arrived. The city gates opened for the wild man, now clothed and civil, but still bearing the presence of something deeper, something raw and ancient. The people gathered in hushed clusters to see him. Children peeked around corners, women whispered prayers, men exchanged nervous glances. This was the one spoken of in dreams, the one the gods had sent. His feet, though now calloused by city stone, still moved like they remembered the earth. His eyes, though softened by human love, still held the echo of stars seen from treetop shadows. The meeting between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was not gentle. It was not warm. It was like thunder striking thunder. The two clashed in the streets of Uruk, grappling not just with their arms, but with their very fates. Stone shattered beneath them. Dust swirled like a storm around their feet. Onlookers gasped and ran for cover. Gilgamesh, who had never been matched, now struggled. Enkidu, though unfamiliar with cities, moved with primal grace and power. They fought as if testing not just each other, but the meaning of their existence. The battle did not end in blood. It ended in stillness. A moment hung in the air where their eyes met, not with rage, but with recognition. Gilgamesh, chest heaving, stared into the face of the only man who had ever stood against him without fear. Enkidu, equally breathless, saw in Gilgamesh not just a king, but a soul, flawed, fierce, fragile. And then, like the tide receding from a great storm, they lowered their arms. They stood still, side by side, as if the gods had woven their destinies together in that single breath. And something unexpected bloomed between them. A bond, not of power or politics, but of brotherhood, of understanding, of the quiet, wordless knowing that passes between those who have both fought and forgiven. In each other, they had discovered something they lacked. Gilgamesh saw in Enkidu the purity of the earth, the unshaken courage of the wild. Enkidu saw in Gilgamesh the depth of human will, the burden of leadership, and the ache of a god who did not belong in heaven or on earth. Their friendship grew quickly, as if it had always existed, waiting for the two of them to awaken it. They walked through the city together, and the people looked on in wonder. Gilgamesh laughed, a real laugh, not the proud roar of a king, but the laughter of someone who has finally found another who understands. They spent their days sharing stories, exploring the temples, debating philosophy, strength, fate. They trained together, hunted together, feasted and fasted together. In Enkidu, Gilgamesh no longer felt like a god among ants. And in Gilgamesh, Enkidu found someone who could understand the loneliness of being created for a purpose beyond their choosing. But as their friendship deepened, so too did Gilgamesh's awareness of something he had long buried beneath his divine pride: the fear of death. For the first time, he looked at Enkidu not just as a brother, but as a mirror. Enkidu, though once wild and free, was now mortal. And if Enkidu could bleed, if Enkidu could suffer, then so could he. The realization fell over Gilgamesh like dusk, the subtle but undeniable darkening of certainty. Their bond had awakened something sacred, but it had also brought death closer. No longer was mortality a concept for other men. Now it stood beside him. It laughed with him, walked with him, called him brother. And yet that awareness made life all the more precious. Gilgamesh began to see the world differently. The golden light of the sun on stone, the sweet taste of wine, the smell of rain on the soil. These things had always been there. But now they mattered in a way they never had. For they were finite. They belonged to the realm of the living. He began to ask questions, not out loud, but silently in the quiet hours of dusk. What is a legacy? What happens when I am gone? Will the gods remember me, or will I vanish like the smoke of sacrifice? Enkidu, though not a philosopher, felt these questions too. They would sit together on the rooftops of Uruk, watching the moon rise over the desert and fall into long silences. No words needed to be spoken. They were already sharing what mattered most: time, moments, mortality. Through their friendship, the fear of death did not vanish, but it changed. It no longer loomed as a stranger in the distance. It became a companion, a shadow that gave shape to light. Gilgamesh, the mighty king who once sought to dominate, now began to wonder if perhaps true power lay not in conquest, but in connection. Not in avoiding death, but in learning how to live. And so the story turned. Two men, one born of gods, the other of the earth, walked together through the city, not as ruler and subject, not as predator and prey, but as friends, as souls who had, against all odds, found one another. And with that friendship, a new journey would begin, one that would lead them far beyond the walls of Uruk, into forests of monsters, realms of gods, and the very heart of what it means to be alive. The sun rose high over the city of Uruk, casting long shadows across its carved stone streets. Its walls, strong and proud, stood as a monument to Gilgamesh's power. But something had changed within those walls. The people whispered not of fear but of curiosity. Their mighty king now walked beside a wild man, his equal, his friend. And with that change came a shift in the heart of Gilgamesh himself. He had known domination, command and solitude. Now he knew companionship, and yet something restless still stirred in him, something deep and unyielding, a desire for greatness that could not be satisfied by peace alone. Gilgamesh began to dream once more, but these were no longer nightmares of solitude or death. They were visions of distant lands, of towering forests where no man dared tread, of thunderous roars echoing through trees older than cities. The dreams called him not just to rule, but to test his strength against the forces of the world, to carve his name into the fabric of time. He shared these dreams with Enkidu, whose face darkened as he listened. Gilgamesh spoke of Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest, appointed by the god Enlil to protect it from men. Humbaba, it was said, had a voice like the storm and a face that twisted with the terror of the unknown. His breath scorched the trees, and his eyes could paralyze the heart of the boldest warrior. Gilgamesh wanted to face him, not for vengeance, not for necessity, but for glory. Enkidu was quiet for a long time. He had once roamed the wildlands, and he knew of Humbaba. More than myth, Humbaba was a force of nature itself, as ancient as the wind, as rooted as the trees he guarded. The cedar forest was sacred, a living temple untouched by human ambition. To enter it was to disturb the balance between the mortal and the divine. "You do not understand," Enkidu warned. "This is no man we would face, no king with a sword. Humbaba is the forest's soul. He is not meant to be conquered." But Gilgamesh could not be dissuaded. The thought of living and dying as any ordinary man, forgotten, buried, reduced to dust, filled him with a deeper fear than Humbaba ever could. "If I do not go," he said, "I will have lived for nothing. My name will vanish. My strength will rot in the ground like a broken tool. I must do something eternal." Enkidu hesitated. He did not crave full fame. He had known a life beyond such desires, where the sunrise was enough, where the breath of the lion or the rustle of leaves meant more than any monument. And yet something in Gilgamesh stirred him. Perhaps it was their bond, perhaps it was fate, but he could not let Gilgamesh go alone. So the two prepared. They armed themselves with great axes forged by Uruk's finest smiths. Weapons meant not just to kill, but to challenge the very wild. They prayed at the temples, seeking favour from the gods, though the omens were mixed. The priests cast bones and burned incense, and in the curling smoke they saw both triumph and tragedy. When they departed, the city gathered to watch. Gilgamesh, tall and bright as a flame, and Enkidu, silent and steady as a mountain. Two opposites, bound together, leaving not just to fight a monster, but to confront the unknown. Days passed as they journeyed, the city slowly fading behind them. The landscape grew stranger. The sky seemed wider, the stars more distant. They passed through vast plains and rocky passes until finally the trees began to change. The air grew thicker, heavy with scent, resin, soil, and something older. The trunks of the cedars rose like columns of a forgotten temple. Birds fell silent. The forest watched. And there, at the heart of it, dwelled Humbaba. His presence could be felt before it was seen. The earth trembled beneath their feet. Shadows shifted with a will of their own. When he emerged, it was like watching a mountain move. His face was neither human nor beast, but a mask of dread, shaped by time and thunder. His voice echoed in their bones. Gilgamesh stood firm, though his heart pounded. Enkidu gripped his weapon, though his breath was tight with memory. The battle began not with a roar, but with a silence so deep it cracked the soul. What followed was not a fight of swords, but of will. Humbaba struck with the power of the storm, his cries shaking the canopy. Gilgamesh met him blow for blow, not as a man, but as one reaching toward the divine. Enkidu, though once Humbaba's kin in the wild, fought too, torn between reverence and loyalty. Together they drove the beast back blow by blow until he fell. But in that moment of victory, a strange sorrow passed over them. Humbaba begged for his life. He spoke not as a monster, but as a servant of the gods. "I was placed here," he said, "to protect what must not be broken. You have trespassed into the holy." Gilgamesh hesitated. The choice lay heavy in the air, to spare the guardian and preserve the sacred, or to slay him and ensure a story that would echo through eternity. At Enkidu's urging, perhaps in fear, perhaps in pride, Gilgamesh struck the final blow. Humbaba fell, and with him, a silence deeper than before settled upon the forest. The cedar trees wept. The air grew cold. They had won, but something had changed. The balance had been broken, and though Gilgamesh carried the cedar wood as a trophy, though he stood proud in the light of conquest, There was a weight in his eyes. Enkidu said little. He knew what they had done, not just to Humbaba, but to the order of the world. The glory Gilgamesh sought had been earned, but at a price not yet understood. Far away in the high heavens, the gods stirred. What had been unleashed in the forest would soon come back to claim what was owed. The return from the cedar forest should have been a triumph. Gilgamesh and Enkidu had done what no man had ever dared. They had entered the sacred woods, faced down the monstrous guardian appointed by the gods, and emerged victorious. Their names were now etched into the bark of legend, and the cedar trees they felled would be used to build the gates of Uruk, a symbol of their unmatched courage. But what they brought back with them was not only wood and fame, they carried something invisible, yet heavy, a presence that seemed to cling to them, follow them, whisper to them in their sleep. At first the city rejoiced. The people of Uruk cheered their king and his wild brother. Dancers spun in the streets, musicians filled the air with celebration, and the temples overflowed with offerings. Gilgamesh stood at the center of it all, not only as a ruler, but as a myth come to life. Yet as he bathed in glory, his thoughts began to shift. His gaze often wandered beyond the horizon. The cheers of the people seemed to grow distant, muted by something rising within him, an awareness that victory had not brought the peace he expected. Enkidu noticed it first, not in words, but in the way Gilgamesh grew restless at night, pacing beneath the stars. He no longer slept as deeply. He no longer laughed as easily. The dreams had returned, and they were no longer dreams of glory. But it was not Gilgamesh's fate that would fall first. It was Enkidu's. One night, Enkidu dreamed a strange and terrifying dream. In it, he saw the gods gathered in the heavens, their faces stern, their eyes burning with judgment. Enlil, the god of wind and authority, spoke of their defiance. "They have killed the guardian I placed in the cedar forest," he said. "They have upset the sacred balance." Shamash, the sun god who had favoured them during their journey, pleaded on their behalf, but the others would not be moved. One life, they decreed, must be taken. One of the two must die. When Enkidu awoke, his skin was cold with dread. He told Gilgamesh of the dream, his voice quiet, subdued. "The gods are angry," he said. "They are coming for me." At first, Gilgamesh dismissed it. He could not imagine a world where Enkidu would be taken from him. They had shared so much, the wild, the battle, the silence of brotherhood. They were, in his mind, invincible together. But over the next days, Enkidu began to weaken. A strange sickness took hold of him. His strength faded, his skin grew pale, his breath shallow. The wild man who had once run with lions now struggled to lift his head. Gilgamesh was helpless. He sat beside Enkidu's bed, his great hands gripping the edge of the linens, as if he could anchor his friend to the world through sheer force of will. He called upon the gods, cursed them, begged them. He offered sacrifices. He went to the temple and wept like a child. He who had never bowed before any man now fell to his knees in despair. But nothing could stop what had been set in motion. As the sickness deepened, Enkidu's mind wandered. He spoke of the forest, of the animals who had once been his family. He spoke of Shamhat, the woman who had opened his eyes to love and sorrow. And then he spoke of death, not in fear but in wonder. "I do not know where I go," he whispered, "but I feel it coming." Gilgamesh tried to soothe him. He told stories of their adventures, of the times they hunted and feasted, of the laughter they had shared. But his voice trembled. There was no story he could tell that would undo the finality that loomed before them. And then, one morning, Enkidu was gone. Gilgamesh sat in stunned silence. The room seemed too still, the city outside too distant. He touched Enkidu's face, still and cold, and something inside him broke. A soundless fracture that would never quite heal. He did not cry at first, not out of pride, but out of disbelief. The idea that someone so alive, so powerful, so beloved could simply vanish from the world, it made no sense. He watched the body for hours, waiting for it to rise, but it did not. And then came the grief. Raw and unrelenting, it crashed over him like a wave. Gilgamesh tore his clothes. He covered himself in dust. He roamed the wilderness in mourning, refusing to return to his throne. He no longer cared for feasts or honours or riches. The world had narrowed to a single, echoing loss. But from that grief, a terrible realization bloomed. If Enkidu, strong, fearless Enkidu, could die, then so could he. The god-king who once sought eternal glory now feared eternal silence. Death was no longer an idea. It had become real, close, undeniable. Gilgamesh could see it in the stillness of his friend's limbs, in the silence where laughter used to be, and it terrified him. Thus began his true journey, not through forests or battlefields, but into the heart of mortality. Gilgamesh would seek answers from the gods, from ancient beings, from the edges of the world itself. He would chase immortality like a man running from a shadow, but all of it, every step, every prayer, every act of desperation was born from this one moment. The death of Enkidu shattered the illusion of invincibility, and from that shattering, Gilgamesh would seek to find not only eternal life, but meaning. It was here, in the ashes of friendship, that the myth of Gilgamesh transformed from a tale of power to a meditation on the human soul. The desert wind blew across the empty lands beyond Uruk, whispering through canyons and over dry riverbeds, scattering dust like forgotten memories. In this bleak, uncharted world walked a man stripped of everything, of pride, of certainty, of joy. Gilgamesh, once the mighty king who challenged monsters and defied gods, now wandered barefoot and broken. His hair hung wild and tangled. His royal robes had been traded for animal skins. He had become a shadow of the man he once was. He walked because he could not rest. He walked because death had come too close. Enkidu, his brother, in arms, his only true companion, had been taken by the gods. And now, every breath Gilgamesh drew was poisoned by the knowledge that his own fate would one day be the same. He had stared into the still face of death and had not found peace, only terror. In his agony, he resolved to find the one being who had escaped what all others must face, Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, the Ancient One, the Immortal, the survivor of the Great Flood, the man whom the gods had granted eternal life. If he existed, if the stories were true, then perhaps he held the secret Gilgamesh so desperately sought. Not glory, not power, but escape. Escape from death itself. And so Gilgamesh journeyed farther than any man before him. He left the walls of Uruk behind. He passed through the burning deserts, where the sun scorched the stones and the nights were haunted by jackals. He crossed plains where no grass grew and skies that held no stars. His feet bled, his lips cracked, but he did not stop. Eventually, he came to a mountain range so vast it split the sky in two. The mountain stood like sleeping gods, silent and unmoving. There he encountered two scorpion beings, half human and half divine, their eyes glowing with the fire of the heavens. They guarded the gate to the path of the sun, the tunnel through which Shamash, the sun god, passed each night on his journey beneath the world. At first they barred his way. No mortal had ever travelled through the tunnel of night. But when they saw the grief in Gilgamesh's eyes, when they heard his plea that he sought not fame or wealth but a cure for death, they let him pass. Not because he was strong, but because he was desperate. The tunnel was a passage of pure darkness, no flame would light, no stars could guide him. For 12 leagues he walked in blackness, where even thoughts seemed to vanish, where the silence pressed down like a weight. But he did not turn back. His fear of death was greater than any fear of the dark. When at last he emerged, he found himself in a strange and radiant land. Trees shimmered with jewels instead of leaves. The sea lapped gently against crystal shores. It was a place untouched by time, suspended between worlds. Here he met Siduri, the divine tavern keeper who lived near the edge of the waters of death. Siduri watched him approach with suspicion. She saw a man who looked like a wild animal, but carried the weight of kings in his voice. She listened to his story, and then she did something rare. She offered him rest. She told him to abandon his quest. to return home, to eat, drink, and take joy in life while it lasted. The gods gave immortality to themselves, she said. For you, Gilgamesh, they gave something else, the chance to live fully and die well. But Gilgamesh could not accept this, not yet. He had tasted the sweetness of companionship. He had known the agony of its loss. How could he return to life, knowing it would all be taken from him? Siduri sighed and gave him instructions. He must find Ushanabi, the boatman of Utnapishtim, who dwelt near the shore. Gilgamesh sought him out and demanded passage across the waters of death. But first he destroyed the sacred tools of Ushanabi's boat, perhaps in anger or ignorance or sheer exhaustion. As a result, he was forced to cut poles from the forest one by one to push the boat forward, never allowing his skin to touch the cursed waters. For days they drifted, farther than far, through a sea where no birds flew, where no breeze stirred, where time seemed to sleep. And finally, they reached the farther shore, where Utnapishtim lived with his wife in a place outside the reach of men. When Gilgamesh laid eyes on him, he was stunned. Utnapishtim looked no different than any old man. Grey-haired, thin, weathered by time, he was not glowing with divine power. He was not wrapped in eternal youth. "How could this be?" Gilgamesh asked. "You have the gift I seek. How do you still look like this?" Utnapishtim looked at Gilgamesh with pity. "You seek to escape death," he said. "But do you understand what you are asking?" And so Utnapishtim told his story. Long ago the gods had sent a great flood to destroy mankind, for their noise and chaos had wearied the heavens. But Yah, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim in a dream. He built a great boat, brought aboard his family, animals, and seeds of life. When the flood came, it covered the world. All perished, except those aboard the ark. When the waters receded, the gods repented. They granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, not as a reward, but as an exception. It was a one-time gift, he told Gilgamesh. Never again will it be granted. Not to you, not to anyone. Gilgamesh sat in silence, the words sinking into him like cold rain. All his suffering, all his travels, all his hopes, and still the answer was no. But Utnapishtim, seeing his sorrow, offered the one last chance. "There is a plant," he said, "that grows at the bottom of the deep sea. It will restore your youth, though not your life forever. If you can retrieve it, you may at least renew your days." Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet, dove into the black waters, and found the plant. Triumph surged in him for the first time in many days. He had not conquered death, but he had stolen something back from its grasp, and yet even that would be taken from him. As he rested on his journey home, a serpent slithered from the shadows and stole the plant. It vanished into the earth, and with it, Gilgamesh's last hope. He did not scream, he did not fight. He simply watched the water ripple where it had disappeared. There, in the silence of his failure, he began to understand. The journey through the underworld had not given him immortality, but it had given him something else, a deeper truth, a vision of the fragile beauty of life, the understanding that what is brief can also be meaningful, that the fear of death is not conquered by running from it, but by living so fully that even death must pause and honour the soul. And so Gilgamesh turned back, not empty-handed, but forever changed. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a dark and quiet mirror reflecting a sky where even the stars seemed distant and weary. Here, beyond the boundaries of maps and memory, beyond the knowledge of kings and the reach of prayers, Gilgamesh had arrived, exhausted, heartbroken, and utterly alone. He stood before a simple dwelling, weathered by wind and time, nestled on the shores of stillness. This was the edge of the world, and here lived the man who should not exist, the one untouched by death, Utnapishtim. He was not what Gilgamesh had expected. There was no divine glow about him, no eternal youth, no awe-inspiring majesty. He looked like a man who had grown old and simply continued to exist. His back was bent slightly with age. His hands bore the marks of labour. His eyes were calm, as if they had seen too much to be surprised anymore. And yet, in that quiet figure lay a mystery greater than any monster or god Gilgamesh had ever faced. The mystery of why some live forever, and why most do not. Gilgamesh fell to his knees before him, not as a king, not even as a warrior, but as a man stripped bare by grief. "I have wandered far," he said. "I have lost my friend. I have faced God's darkness and death itself. I seek only one thing, the secret you possess. Tell me how you were granted eternal life. Tell me how I might escape the fate that took Enkidu and waits now for me." Utnapishtim studied him for a long time before speaking. When he did, his voice was low and slow, like a river that has forgotten how to rush. "You seek a gift that was never meant to be given," he said. "What you call a blessing, I know as a burden." Then he told his story. Long ago, when the world was still young and the gods were closer to the earth, there was a time when mankind had grown too loud, too many. Their voices disturbed the gods' peace. They quarrelled, made war, built cities that climbed toward the heavens, and worshipped with arrogance instead of humility. Enlil, the god of wind and order, decided that the world must be cleansed. He decreed a flood, a vast, inescapable deluge that would drown every man, woman, child, and beast. But Ea, the god of wisdom and water, loved humankind. He whispered the secret to Utnapishtim in a dream. "Build a boat, save your family, gather animals and seeds, the essence of life itself." And so Utnapishtim obeyed. He built a massive vessel with pitch and timber, sealed it tight against the wrath to come, and then the rains began. For 7 days and 7 nights the skies poured down as if the heavens had cracked open. The sea rose and swallowed the land. Cities vanished. Mountains disappeared beneath waves. The world became a single body of water, silent and terrible. Utnapishtim floated on the endless tide, surrounded by death, carried by fate. When the storm finally broke and the sun once again touched the face of the earth, there was nothing left but silence. He released a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. And when the raven did not return, he knew that land had emerged. The boat settled on a mountain. Life began again. And then came the gods. They gathered like clouds around a fire. Some were enraged. How had a mortal survived their judgment? But others wept. The destruction had been too great, too complete. The gods were not immune to regret. In that moment of divine contradiction, they granted Utnapishtim and his wife the gift of eternal life, not out of reward, but out of guilt. They were to be set apart, removed from the world of men, kept forever at the edge of existence, neither truly alive among the living, nor dead among the dead. Gilgamesh listened in silence, the tale sinking into him like rain on stone. "It was a one-time gift," Utnapishtim said softly. "A mistake the gods will not repeat. Immortality is not a right. It is not a prize to be earned. It is exile. Do you truly know what you ask for?" Gilgamesh's hands trembled. He had come so far, and yet the door to eternity remained shut. His desperation rose again like a tide. "Then let me prove myself. Give me a trial, a test, anything." Utnapishtim looked at him with a kind of mournful affection. "Very well," he said. "Stay awake. Do not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights. If you can resist even the smallest taste of death, perhaps you can be trusted with the secret of escaping it." Gilgamesh agreed without hesitation. He sat down, straight-backed, eyes wide, his heart hammering with determination. But exhaustion is not like other enemies. It does not roar or strike. It seeps in slow and soft like fog. And within moments, just moments, Gilgamesh's eyes closed. His head dipped. Sleep, gentle and absolute, claimed him. He slept for 7 days straight. Utnapishtim's wife, moved by pity, baked a loaf of bread beside him each day. When Gilgamesh awoke, confused and angry, the 7 loaves sat beside him, each a marker of time past, some soft and warm, others mouldy, others crumbling into dust. "You see," Utnapishtim said gently, "you could not resist even this small death." Gilgamesh sat in silence. The truth could no longer be denied. He was not meant to live forever, but Utnapishtim, seeing the raw sorrow in him, offered a final kindness. "There is a plant," he said, "hidden deep beneath the waters. It will not grant you immortality, but it will restore your youth for a time. Perhaps that is enough." With renewed purpose, Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet, dove beneath the waters, and retrieved the plant. It had thorns sharp as a lion's teeth and leaves that curled with ancient energy. He emerged with hope in his heart. He had not won eternity, but he had wrestled something back from the void. He set out toward Uruk, dreaming of giving the plant to the elders, of sharing its power, of renewing life and forestalling death. But one night as he bathed in a quiet pool, a serpent slithered from the rocks, drawn by the scent of the plant. In a single motion, it swallowed the gift and vanished into the earth, shedding its skin as it went, a symbol of renewal meant for another. Gilgamesh watched, stunned. There was no struggle, no battle, just loss, silent and complete. And yet, he did not scream, he did not rage. A deep calm settled over him, not of peace but of understanding. He had pursued eternal life across deserts, mountains and seas. He had spoken to gods and witnessed the ends of the world, and in the end he had returned to the place where all men must stand, between the beginning and the end. The story of the flood and of Utnapishtim's lonely immortality had not granted him what he sought, but it had shown him what mattered, not to escape death, but to live so well that death, when it comes, cannot take what you've truly become. Gilgamesh walked slowly now, not with the eager stride of a king chasing glory, nor with the desperate pace of a man running from death, but with the careful, quiet steps of someone who had seen too much. The wind moved softly across the plain, carrying the scent of soil and wild flowers. The sky stretched wide above him, vast and eternal. Somewhere behind him, the edge of the world faded into memory. Somewhere ahead, the walls of Uruk awaited his return. He carried nothing but silence and the memory of what had almost been. The plant was gone. The serpent had taken it, disappearing beneath the earth with the one chance Gilgamesh had to reclaim his youth. He had watched it happen, powerless, wordless. There was no battle, no thunderous clash, no heroic last stand, just a quiet theft and the soft sound of scales sliding over stone. At first, he had stood in disbelief, staring at the ripples where the snake had vanished. Then the grief had come, not the grief that screams and howls, but the deeper kind, the kind that moves through the body like water soaking into dry earth. A slow, heavy sorrow, not only for the plant, but for all he had lost, his friend, his innocence, the belief that life could be cheated or bargained with. He did not curse the gods, he did not shout at the sky, he simply began to walk. As he travelled, something strange happened. He started to notice things again, small things, things he had overlooked in his hunger for immortality. The way the light fell through the branches of trees, the sound of birds calling to one another, the texture of sand beneath his fingers when he knelt by a stream. The world, which had once been a stage for his conquests, now seemed sacred in its own right, fragile, precious. Every step became an act of return, not just to Uruk, but to himself. Gilgamesh had begun his journey as a man who wanted to defeat death. But now, death no longer felt like the enemy. It was part of the pattern. The serpent had shown him that. The plant had been snatched away in a moment, yes, but in doing so it had been reborn. The creature had shed its skin and vanished, leaving behind a sign that life renews itself, not by resisting death, but by moving through it. And so, as he drew near the city, a new thought took root. If he could not escape death, perhaps he could find a different kind of immortality. Not one that lasted forever in the body, but one that echoed on through the lives of others, through memory, through meaning, through the things built, spoken, remembered, loved. At last, the walls of Uruk came into view. Tall and proud, they stood like ancient sentinels, guarding the legacy of generations. He had once seen these walls as proof of his greatness, stones to glorify his name. Now, he saw them as something else, a gift to those who would come after. Shelter, story, continuity. He climbed the steps to the top of the wall just as he had in his youth, and gazed out over the land. The field stretched far, green and golden. The Euphrates wound like a ribbon through the distance. The people moved below, planting, building, laughing, grieving, living. He breathed deeply. The air smelled like dust and sun and memory. And it was here, atop these stones, that Gilgamesh finally understood what he had failed to grasp in all his travels. Immortality is not a thing to be grasped. It is not a trophy, nor a secret guarded by ancient beings. It is not a flower pulled from the depths, nor a name carved in gold. It is found in the love that binds people together, in the sorrow that makes us human, in the moments we choose to be present, to be kind, to create, to remember. He thought of Enkidu, his friend, his brother, his mirror. Enkidu was gone, yes, but his memory burned like a fire in Gilgamesh's chest. Every step of this journey had been shaped by him, every lesson learned, every tear shed. That too was a kind of living. Perhaps that was what the gods had meant all along. Not to deny man immortality as a punishment, but to guide him towards something deeper. To force him to see that a fleeting life is no less valuable than an endless one. That brevity gives life its brilliance. Gilgamesh descended from the wall and walked the streets of his city. The people watched him in silence. He was not the same man who had left. His body was leaner, marked by travel and hardship, but his eyes had changed most of all. They no longer burned with conquest. They carried something gentler, a sadness, yes, but also a clarity, a grace. He began to rule differently, with more wisdom, more listening, more humility. He wrote down the story of his journey, not just the battles and monsters, but the moments of doubt, of grief, of awakening. He recorded the story of Enkidu, so that his friend would not vanish with time. He preserved the tale of the flood, the serpent, the plant, the dream of immortality. Not as a manual for eternal life, but as a mirror for others to see themselves in. And in doing so, he passed on what he had learned. That to be human is to love and to lose, to seek and to fail, to grieve and to grow. That death, though final, is not the end of meaning. And that somewhere in the weaving of stories and the building of cities and the passing of hands from generation to generation, we do find a kind of immortality after all. Not in escaping death, but in embracing life. The sun cast its golden light across the towers and walls of Uruk, stretching long shadows across the city that Gilgamesh had once built with the fire of his ambition. These walls had stood for years before his journey began, but now, returning after all he had seen, he looked at them differently. What once had seemed like monuments to his power now appeared as monuments to memory, endurance, and purpose. He ran his hand along the ancient stones that would stand long after his body had returned to dust. Each one had been laid with care, with sweat and toil, not by the gods but by men. These walls were not eternal in the divine sense, but they were lasting, resilient, a part of the earth's great memory. And in them, Gilgamesh began to see a reflection of what immortality truly meant. He walked the perimeter of the city slowly, eyes lingering on every curve and corner, every brick that had weathered the storms of time. These walls were not perfect. They had been patched, cracked, stained. But they were strong. They stood. And so too would the legacy of those who built them. It struck him then, that perhaps the gods, in denying him the secret of eternal life, had offered him something greater, the chance to understand life, to live fully in its briefness, and to leave behind something that mattered. Gilgamesh began to think deeply about legacy, not the kind written in the stars or preserved in heavenly scrolls, but the kind etched into the lives of others, in the stories told by parents to their children, in the customs passed through generations, in the city that fed, protected, and cradled its people. The idea of being remembered became something more sacred than simply being immortal, to be remembered rightly, to be remembered for kindness, for wisdom, for strength of spirit. He walked among his people and saw them with new eyes. He saw a potter shaping clay with fingers stained in earth, repeating motions learned from his father and passed to his son. He saw a mother braiding her daughter's hair, humming an old tune that once echoed in the voice of her own mother. He saw scribes carving cuneiform into wet tablets, preserving records, laws, poems, stories of kings, of gods, of common folk whose names might never be known, but whose lives were woven into the great tapestry of the city. Gilgamesh realized that these too were forms of immortality. He thought of Enkidu often, not just in sadness, but in gratitude. His friend's death had cracked him open, torn down the illusion that life could be controlled or extended by force. Through Enkidu, he had learned that what is fleeting can still be sacred, that love is worth its pain, that friendship, though mortal, carves permanent chambers in the soul. In the days that followed, Gilgamesh ruled with a quiet strength. He no longer sought to dominate, but to serve, so he listened more than he spoke. He judged with a sense of compassion rooted in lived suffering. He protected his people not to glorify himself, but because their well-being had become a part of his purpose. He commissioned new walls to be built, not just to guard the city, but to inscribe its stories, on tablets and stones. He had scribes carve the history of Uruk, the tale of the flood, the journey to the ends of the earth, and the bond between two men who had once challenged the world together. He told them everything, even his failures, even the moment he slept when he had sworn not to, even the moment the serpent stole the plant from his hands, because he knew now that truth, in all its pain and imperfection, was worth preserving, because someone, someday, would read those words and see their own soul reflected in them. And so Gilgamesh, the man who had once fought to become immortal, became something else entirely. He became a vessel of memory, of wisdom earned through tears and trials. He became not a god, but a guide. He would die. He knew that now, and he accepted it. His bones would one day lie beneath the soil, like all who came before and all who would come after. But the walls of Uruk would stand, the stories would live on, the people would remember, not only the king who built great gates and slew monsters, but the man who returned changed, who learned to weep, to listen, to build not for his own name, but for the generations that would follow. And in that he found peace. No longer did he fear the silence of death, for he had found another kind of voice, one that would echo in stone and song, in myth and memory. In the end, it was not a magic plant, nor a divine decree that preserved Gilgamesh's name. It was the city he returned to. It was the walls he walked. It was the life he chose to live after losing everything. Time passes. Kingdoms rise and fall, rivers shift their course, languages change and cities crumble. Yet somehow the name of Gilgamesh remains, whispered across millennia, carried on the breath of storytellers, carved into clay tablets that survived flood, fire, and forgetting. In dusty museum vaults, in quiet university libraries, in the imaginations of poets and scholars, his story lives on. But what is it that makes this tale, born more than 4,000 years ago, still speak to us? Gilgamesh's journey is not just the story of a king or a hero or a demigod. It is the story of a man facing the most profound truth of existence, that everything we love will one day vanish, that even the mightiest will die, that no wall is high enough, no sword sharp enough, no prayer loud enough to escape the end. And yet, in the face of this truth, Gilgamesh does not turn to despair forever. He walks through it. He allows death to wound him, not just Enkidu's death, but the death of his illusions, the death of his pride. And on the other side of that pain, he emerges changed, not immortal, but awake. This is why the story still matters, because each of us, in our own way, is Gilgamesh. Each of us begins our life believing we're invincible. We strive, we build, we seek greatness, whether in our careers, our creations, or the silent victories of daily life. We chase things that shimmer in the distance: success, beauty, permanent. We love people with the desperate hope that love can somehow defy time. And then inevitably we encounter loss. A friend dies, a parent fades, a dream dissolves. The mirror shows lines that weren't there before. And suddenly we know what Gilgamesh knew on the road to Utnapishtim, that death is not a tale told to others. It is a truth that waits for all of us. But that truth is not the end of meaning. In fact, it is where meaning begins. Gilgamesh teaches us that it is precisely because life is brief that it becomes valuable, that the sweetness of a moment lies in its passing, that love is not weakened by the knowledge that it ends, but made more beautiful because we choose it anyway. His transformation, from tyrant king to wise ruler, from a man who sought to dominate the world to one who sought to understand it, is the transformation we are all called to make. He began with the belief that immortality lay in personal glory, but he ended with the knowledge that it lay in the connections we make, the things we build for others, the stories we pass on. In that sense, the story of Gilgamesh is not really about death. It's about life. It's about living with open eyes and an open heart. It's about grieving deeply when loss comes but not being destroyed by it. It's about returning home with wisdom gained through pain and choosing every day to build something meaningful, whether a city, a friendship, or a single act of kindness. Even the final words of the epic do not shout of conquest. They are quiet. They invite the reader or the listener to look upon the walls of Uruk and see what endures. Not Gilgamesh's sword or the monsters he slew, but the work of many hands, the fruits of shared labour, the strength of a community. In those walls lies his true legacy. And so, as we come to the end of this ancient journey, we are left not with despair, but with a sense of sacred responsibility. A whisper, soft but steady, that says, "You too will pass from this world, but what will you leave behind? A story, a kindness, a truth spoken gently to someone who needed to hear it." The Epic of Gilgamesh has lasted thousands of years, not because it tells us how to escape death, but because it teaches us how to live with the knowledge of it, how to find beauty in impermanence, how to be human with courage, and perhaps most of all, how to love with the knowledge that love cannot be kept, only given, freely, fully, now. That is the echo of Gilgamesh in all of us, and as long as we remember that, the story never truly ends.